Sudan's transitional government has signed a historic peace agreement with the Sudan Revolutionary Front, which is a coalition of rebel groups from the regions of Darfur, Southern Kordofan, and Blue Nile. Is peace on the horizon for Sudan? That is going to be the topic here today. My name is Liv Tønnesen, and I'm a research director at CMI. And with me on this panel, I have Mansour Assal, professor at the University of Khartoum, and Gunnar Søberg, former director at CMI and emeritus researcher. Before we start the discussion, Gunnar would like to say a few words about a friend and colleague who unexpectedly passed away last week, Hassan Abdelati.
Yes, thank you, Liv. I would like to use this opportunity to pay tribute to a very close friend and colleague and partner for more than 30 years in the cooperation between Bergen and Khartoum, Dr. Hassan Abdelati, who died last week tragically in a traffic accident. Actually, he was on his way to an important mission. Some of you will know that Eastern Sudan has been in trouble for months now, and there have been quite serious conflicts, and Hassan was on his way to do some mediation and trying to help out and facilitate some processes. But according to information I had, the car came out of control, and he died there tragically. He was, I would say, a very courageous man. He lost his job almost very soon after the Islamists came to power, actually in the early 90s, because in the university where he was a senior lecturer at the time. Then he became part of the cooperation with Bergen. He was very active in the Red Sea area program. He was always involved in Eastern Sudan as a consultant when he lost his job at the university. And he was, as I said, he was critical, always critical, but he kept us on our toes. He was courageous, but he was also a gentle, conscientious person. He spent some time in Bergen at that time at what was called the Center for Development Studies. And it's among the less important things he did, but still we will remember him for it, is that he often came to work very early in the morning, like 4 o'clock. And once when he came to work, there was burglars and thieves emptying the Center for Development Studies for all the computers and taking them out of the windows. And he was managed to alert the police, and all the computers were saved. And this is one of the more curious things about Hassan Abdelati and his relationship to the university. But it was a very sad event. So I would wanted to pay tribute to him and his memory this morning.
Thank you so much, Gunnar. I want to welcome our audience here in Bergen and also our online audience. There will be a Q&A at the end for the audience in Bergen. You can ask the question in person. And for the online audience, I kindly ask you to write your questions in the Q&A section. So, Mansour, could you just give us a little bit of background and to the Juba peace deal, and what is it about, sort of in broad strokes?
Well, thank you very much, Liv, and I'm glad to be here. Let me just add my voice to what Gunnar said in paying tribute to Hassan Abdelati, who was part of the Khartoum-Bergen link for a very long time. He was one of the key persons in all the work that was done on the Red Sea area program. And even in Arus, he was with us for a long time. The peace process that ended with the agreement that was signed early this month in Juba was a process that was started a year ago, actually. It was started immediately after Hamdok was sworn in as prime minister. But we recall that even during the earlier period of the Transition Military Council, it was made very clear that achieving peace was one of the key objectives. And as a matter of fact, this was clear in the slogans of the revolution, Hurriya, Salam, Adala. So peace was among the pillars. And, at the early days, it was seen that this could be achieved in a matter of months. Some people spoke of 3 months, others spoke of a maximum of 6 months. But it appears that it wasn't that simple, and people were jubilant at the beginning. People were euphoric. People were, they're saying that, the problem to achieving peace was Bashir's regime, and since that regime is no longer in place, it shouldn't be a problem for us to get there. But of course, the problems of Sudan are quite complex, and that was why it took the parties a year to reach to the agreement that was signed a couple of weeks back. Now, one of the points that I would like to mention here was that part of those who signed the agreement with the transitional government were among the supporters of the revolution. As a matter of fact, they were signatories to the so-called FFC declaration. And for many Sudanese, the question that they asked was, if you were signatories to the FFC declaration, isn't it strange that you negotiate with your allies, So that was part of the dynamics which you were part of the peace negotiations. It took a long time, and we got what we got by way of an agreement that was signed 2 weeks ago.
Can you give us like 5 most important bullet points of what the agreement says?
Well, basically, the agreement addressed key issues, security arrangements, and then social and economic aspects like the return of refugees and IDPs, and then development package to the areas affected by war, and also power sharing, of course. That was part of the deal.
So there's been civil wars and armed conflict in Sudan since before independence, and there has also been a lot of peace deals. What makes this one different from the ones in the past?
Well, thank you. This is a good question. Of course, we all know that they were 5 agreements that were signed during the Bashir's regime. And actually, a lot of people were asking exactly the same question: what makes this peace deal different from others? To me, this is different from others. The first thing is that many groups were part of this. In the former regime's tactic, the act was just to make an agreement with a single armed group. This brought different groups together, and of course, it did not succeed to bring everyone on board, as we still have 2 armed groups that were outside the agreement. But the very fact that this brought a number of groups makes it different from others. The second reason why this time is different is that the context is different. We have a political change, we have a new government in place. Bashir's regime was famous for its effort to sign agreement only to abrogate them, This time, a different government in place, different dynamics. And the third reason that I see as making this agreement different from previous ones is that there seems to be some sort of sincerity. The parties to the agreement, the government and the armed groups, seems to be more sincere, seems to be more genuine about implementing the agreement. And I think there is a chance that this time is going to be different from the previous ones.
Gunnar, so Hassan Abdel-Ati was on his way to mediate in the east. So there has been, in a region where there has been relatively stability during the Bashir regime, there's recently been outbreak of local sort of armed violence between the Hadandawa and the Amr. Do you think that the Juba peace deal will also have positive consequences for the East?
Well, we always have to be hopeful, and I still maintain that during the last 2 years in this whole belt, I think from Pakistan in the east to Mali in the west, I think the most encouraging development has been in Sudan. Because we still have a revolution going and we can still be hopeful for a positive result. Having said that, there are of course many hurdles. And when you talk about these, in many ways, both new and old conflicts, we have seen over the last year, and particularly in Eastern Sudan, some concentrated and urbanized conflicts, for example, in Port Sudan. And they will not necessarily be affected by this peace agreement because the armed movements have not been involved in these conflicts. These are in many ways, I interpret them as being new in the sense that we have a new political order in Khartoum, and there is fear as well as competition about how to position yourself in this order. And unfortunately, there is then a tendency, based on the history of Sudan, that this becomes tribal types of conflicts. And then they are also related to the revolution in different ways. For example, just a few days ago, the Prime Minister Hamdok was asked the governor of Kassala in the eastern to resign. After a lot of pressure. He was appointed by Hamdok himself, but since he was a Benyamer, and the Benyamer are not the Hadenwa, you have these tribal issues there. There was this enormous pressure to have him removed, and he was removed 2 days ago. So I think these are conflicts that go back a long time. They have been latent in also and not in the public eye internationally, but we have known about them in Sudan for a long time. And some of them are of a new kind of nature, concentrated, urbanized, and the armed movements which have negotiated peace deal with the government have not been involved in this. So it remains to be seen how they will be affected.
So economic situation in Sudan is not very good at the moment. That's an understatement. It was already bad before the Bashir regime was removed. I mean, many years of economic mismanagement. Then you had the COVID-19 pandemic and more recently the floods. And now you have this historic peace agreement that promises a lot in terms of development, in terms of healthcare, etc. Everything, all of this would cost money. So can the transitional government afford to implement this agreement?
I think the simple answer is no.
Yeah.
I think there is a heavy legacy from the old regime, and the Sudanese will suffer from this for a long time. This has to do with the poverty, inequalities, corruption, the lack of investments in productive sectors, particularly agriculture. There is still a great potential. But there are also additional issues that are becoming clearer now. There is, for example, a very large illicit economy which needs to be brought into the public economy. The resource flows, a lot of resource flows are still outside the public economy. And this illicit economy is also it's related to gold, which has taken over after oil as a big export item, but there are also other items being involved in this kind of illicit trade. And the second issue is, of course, that the military as well as the intelligence agencies have been engaged for many, many years in accumulating resources, running enterprises, I mean, even factories and so on. And this is again an issue of how can these resources being brought into the Ministry of Finance, so to speak. So these are the sort of additional issues that are becoming clearer now, which are needed. But if you look at the agreement, and Mansour may correct me on this, but as far as I understand, just in Darfur, there is a pledge, to allocate several $100 million for development funds, and you have the internally displaced, which are going to back to their homes, and so there is a lot of development projects being promised and being needed, of course, and it will take a lot of money. So by themselves, the Sudanese do not have this money because they come on top of an enormous international debt, like $60 billion US, and this pressure from the US to pay more than $300 million for the embassy bombing of US embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi in 1998, as far as I remember, where the former regime was involved, not by Sudanese bombers, but by somehow some of these people having Sudanese passports, as far as I understand. And it may not help if Trump is losing that. So the economy is going to be a key issue, of course, for the future of the Sudan. One might say that it could be healthy for Sudan to try to struggle on its own, in a sense that you don't pour in a lot of money, and with some unfortunate consequences. But at the moment, this is, of course, a great problem.
Mansour, I mean, already mentioned the US and the economic sanctions, and how that is not only continuing to cripple the economy, but since 1993, Sudan has been on the list of countries supporting terrorism. And in order to get off that list, the US is demanding $300 million, and that Sudan should normalize relations with Israel. So how do you think this will not only affect the implementation of the peace agreement and the transition, but how are the Sudanese feeling about this?
Well, first, let me just share Gunnar his pessimism about the difficult economic situation in the country, and that this is going to affect definitely the implementation of the peace agreement. And let us not forget the fact that one of the critical issues that were part of the factors or reasons that led to the failure of the previous agreement was that the economic pledges or the financial pledges that were put either by donors or even by the Sudanese government were not honored in all the agreements. And we actually did an evaluation for these agreements, and one of the conclusions was that one of the critical aspects that led to the failure was the failure to provide the support that was agreed on. So unfortunately, this time we don't see a different situation given the current economic condition, which is affecting all the Sudanese people. And related to this, of course, is your question about the designation of Sudan as being in the SST list. This has been going for decades, and even before signing the agreement, this has been affecting the Sudanese people in a very clear way. And we have been following the discussions between the Sudanese government and the US administration about what to do with this. And one of the things that were put on the table was the normalization of relationship with Israel. I think the US administration wants Sudan to be part of the current move of normalization with Israel. And we saw the partisan bickering in the case of the FFC. And ironically, these members of the FFC were unable to agree on our internal critical issues, and they were ready to agree on something that is quite strange, at least for me as a normal Sudanese citizen. If you cannot agree on internal dynamics that affect the transition, how could you be so quick to dismiss, other aspects that were remotely related to our interests. Probably this is my personal view, but I think it's critical that the issue of delisting Sudan is to be taken seriously by the FFC coalition, and we know that the Sudan has gone a long way in dealing in talking with the US with regard to the compensation that Gunnar mentioned, the bombings and the USS Cole. And interestingly, what the US is demanding is 300 million plus. But actually the kind of support the US is paying Sudan is more than that. The US actually pledged more than 300 million in the Berlin Sudan Friends conference. So I don't see a reason for the internal voices that were arguing against paying because practically the US is paying Sudan more than what Sudan is going to pay for the compensation. So there's no point in trying to say that we shouldn't pay the US. That is perhaps a personal point of view, but I see it as part of the dynamics of what's going on. To conclude, I think it's critical for Sudan to be delisted because that would give it an opportunity to make use of the financial support that comes from the World Bank, the IMF, and the African Development Bank. It will also pave the way for Sudan to benefit from the so-called HIPC, heavily indebted and poor countries. That would lead to debt relief, something that Sudan badly needs, to address the dire economic situation that Gunnar talked about.
Thank you, Mansour. We all agree that the economic situation is not good, and that's in order to implement this peace agreement, there is a need for international support. But does Sudan have it, Gunnar?
Well, at the moment, there is a lot of support for the revolution in Europe, mainly, and the European Union, and pledges being made. But at the same time, because of the corona, and of course in Sudan, because of emergency funds needed for after the terrible flooding, which has affected almost 1 million people, as far as I understand. Some of these funds, or lots of these funds, will primarily be emergency funds rather than funds for the more needed for long-term development. In a way, I think this kind of money that Sudan needs is only found in the Gulf these days. I mean, we are talking about substantial sums of money. But there again, you have a very difficult situation, or at least this situation which Sudan must pay attention to, and that is the role of the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. They promised, just after the revolution, quite, I think, as far as I remember, $3 billion to support the revolution, but they came up with half a billion. And then after that, they were themselves, of course, affected by corona, but they're also sitting, I think, on the fence. My interpretation is that these two countries, in addition to Egypt, which is very important, of course, would not necessarily be very positive to a real democratic development in Sudan. On the other hand, they would not like to see Bashir and his type of Islamists coming back to power. So that is a card that the Sudanese now have on their hand. They have one second card, I think, and that is that they have shown the ability to mobilize millions of people. I mean, that was a real people's revolution, and they could do it again. And I think these are the two strong cards that the Sudanese government today has towards the neighborhood. The Egyptians, of course, want them to have exactly the same opinion as Egypt on the the way the big Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia should be managed. And so far the Sudanese have seemed to be going with the Egyptians more and more. But the big money is in among Qatar, Emirates, and Saudi Arabia when it comes down to it. But I'm not sure that that Sudan will receive those kind of money, not at least not in the short term. So this is it's a very difficult external environment. But the US at the moment is on top of that list of difficulties, and don't bet on it that it will be easier when hopefully Trump loses his election, because actually the new pressures have come from Democrats that actually the Sudanese should pay more than $300 to the victims of the bombing of these two embassies. Because the African victims with no US passport should get the same as the Americans. And besides, wasn't the Sudan also involved in 9/11? That has come up as a new issue. Sudan was not involved in 9/11, but it's coming up in the political process internally in the US. And so at least for a while now, it's going to be, it seems, delayed. And this morning on Sudan Tribute, it was reported that the Americans are renewing the pressure on the Sudan government to normalize relations with Israel. That they are, after a meeting in Abu Dhabi, which they did not obtain the promise from Sudan to normalize relations with Israel, they have renewed pressure. So that's where we are.
Yeah, where we are at the moment is that American politics is far more depressing than Sudanese politics.
Yes.
Moving to Mansour, you said that one of the major points in the peace Juba peace agreement is about power sharing. So the Sudan Revolutionary Front will now gain seats in the Sovereign Council, which is like the civil military council that is now acting as the head of state. They will get several ministers, and in the upcoming parliament, they will get 25%. And interestingly, in a sign of their broader political ambitions, they negotiated an exemption to an article in the constitutional declaration, which would prevent them from running in future elections. So it seems a bit like the civilian component of the government comes out weaker. So will the presence of the Sudan Revolutionary Front complicate an already fragmented political game in Sudan?
Okay, just to add a bit to what Gunnar mentioned about the economy, I think the current elite in the country, and I specifically mean the FFC people, need to be pragmatic and strategic. Gunnar was absolutely correct when he said that the money is with Emirates and Saudi Arabia, absolutely. And I think the elite in Sudan doesn't have a luxury to play this non-aligned type of game at the moment. They have to choose strategically. And I think the choice is quite clear. I'm saying this because of the fact that historically, the Gulf countries have been supporting Sudan. There is no question about that. And much of this support comes unconditionally. It's unlike what comes from Western countries, from the World Bank, from the IMF. These people pay money. They pledged 3.5 billion, as Gunnar said. They just paid 500 million of that, and Sudan still can make use of 3 billion USD. But they have to make a choice. Anyway, it's up to them to do that. Now, with the power sharing, I think the coming of the Sudan Revolutionary Front as a result of the peace agreement will shake the power structure significantly in the country. There is no question about that. And to me personally, that is why a lot of the traditional Sudanese forces, and I mean here some of the political parties, were quite nervous about the Juba peace agreement, because this would imply bringing new people into the various structures and levels, in the cabinet, in the sovereign council, at the transitional parliament, and even at the level of the states. You are bringing new people with significant powers And some of these people are quite experienced, you know, people like Agar, Arman, Jibril. They were part of a long political process and armed struggle. And they're being part of the political scene in the country is going to make a lot of differences. And for some people, this is actually a chance to restructure the traditional Sudanese political scene that was dominant since we got our independence in 1956. There is a need to actually shake up the whole political establishment. And this is an opportunity to do that. Now, whether this is going to negatively affect the civilian component of the government or not is a question to be seen. But my take on this is that there is going to be a very significant political shakeup in the Sudan as a result of the Juba agreement.
But I mean, yeah, I think it was John Wall who described Sudanese politics as a game of musical chairs, the same people going around and then the different people sitting down at a different time and being leaders of the country. So I definitely see your point about, you know, it's good to shake things up a little bit. But what about those who sort of stood in the forefront of the revolution, women and youth? Will they be represented by these new potentially political actors?
Well, I think this is a critical question, and I think this is one of the very difficult tasks for everybody to make sure that women and youth are represented in a just way. And of course, one of the chances to do this is to make sure that they are part of the transitional parliament. But here again, there were a lot of talks and debates of whether to represent groups like the so-called resistance committees in the parliament or not. But I think in the early days there was a talk about the necessity of having at least 40% of the transitional parliament reserved for women. I'm not sure whether they would be able to live up to that pledge or not. But I see that there are a lot of challenges here, and I'm saying this for the simple fact that we have seen the behavior of the FFC, even while they were negotiating with the Transitional Military Council, of completely ignoring women in the negotiations. And actually, there were only one or two ladies in the negotiation team with the TMC at the time. And we have also seen this pattern being repeated in the Juba peace agreement. You know, the talks that led to this agreement. I really failed to see a significant presence or participation of women and youth, of course, in this. So you are quite right in posing this question, because I see it as one of the challenges facing the transition.
Can I also ask you, does the peace agreement, I mean, when the Forces of Freedom and Change and the Transitional Military Council were negotiating, they agreed on a constitutional declaration. Is this peace agreement going to affect the constitutional declaration? Meaning, would it be reopened and renegotiated on certain points?
Yeah, I think it definitely is going to affect the declaration, and I think a couple of days ago, the Dean of the Faculty of Law said at the University of Khartoum said that opening the constitutional declaration is going to lead to constitutional crisis, because he was saying that the FFC is not mandated to renegotiate or reopen the declaration. He was saying that it's only the parliament, the transitional parliament, which it doesn't exist as yet, has the right and mandate to do that. But I think practically this is going to happen, because there are competing legal opinions here. Some legal experts say that in the absence of the transitional parliament, the cabinet and the FFC and the Sovereign Council represent such a body and are mandated to reopen the declaration. And I think this is going to happen because the declaration mentions clearly that the Sovereign Council is made up of 11 members. And as far as I know, the Revolutionary Front will have seats at the Sovereign Council. It's not clear as yet whether the number would be increased. For instance, instead of 11, it could be 13 or 14, or there is a chance that some of the existing members may resign, which to me is highly unlikely. So I think we will see an increase in the number of the Sovereign Council members, as well as increasing the number of cabinet members to accommodate the percentages that were agreed upon in the Juba agreement.
So, I mean, part of the power sharing agreement or arrangements in the agreement is that, you know, rebel forces, which are militarized units, will now be part of decision making in Khartoum. So what happens when these militarized units with small constituencies become more powerful, or will they rather be co-opted into the military sort of powerhouses in Khartoum?
Well, that will be very decisive for the future of Sudan's revolution, actually, because on the positive side, this means that there will be more constituencies who invest their efforts into the survival of the revolution, you know, by bringing rebel groups from the so-called marginalized areas into the transitional government. On the other hand, but it will definitely, as Mansour says, lead to a reorganization of power in Sudan, I think. But the question is how this interaction between the military establishment, the paramilitary establishment with the rapid support forces with Hemeti, and these armed groups, how that will play itself out. Because you could argue, for example, that these are not armed groups which necessarily have a very democratic attitudes and are mainly interested in promoting a democratic Sudan. You could risk, for example, that they would engage in the same kind of activities as the military establishment and the paramilitary groups, that is in accumulation of resources, focusing, for example, in the peripheries, in Niala, rather than Khartoum, for example. Hopefully, and of course, as you say, you use the word of, that would be some kind of co-option, which would not make the kind of change that we want, and the Sudanese want, and which would lead then to kind of reactionary peace rather than a revolutionary peace. But we don't know that yet. But it means if the changes that Mansour indicate may happen in the Sovereign Council, if they don't take place, it means that there is a danger that those forces which actually pushed and succeeded in making a revolution, in particular young people and women, to take those as categories, that they will be more excluded, not less excluded than today. So that is a real danger. And then one might say in the Sudan that, well, we didn't have any alternative. We just have to make these peace agreements, because otherwise we will not succeed in the third issue, which has to do with justice. So that is the argument. But of course, this is going to be a process. And we don't know the result yet.
You mentioned justice, and transitional justice is also explicitly mentioned not only in the Constitutional Declaration, but also in the Juba Peace Deal. And I mean, freedom, peace, and justice was one of the main slogans of the revolution. I know, for at least for the women's movement, justice for sort of human rights abuses and especially sexual and gender-based violence during the Bashir era is really high on the agenda. But how can transitional justice take place in Sudan in a political context where some of those who have been responsible for these human rights abuses are now part of the governing structure?
No, that's a good question, and we have seen from so many other countries that these issues take a back seat, and we take a long time, you know. Before we had this example of Chile, for example, where we had Pinochet for a long time as a dictator with terrible human rights atrocities, and it was not before he was almost dying, not only deposed but almost dying, that they managed in Chile to make transitional justice processes actually. And in the Sudan, you have on so many levels, you have the issue of women's position, and then of course Bashir and the future handing or not handing him over to the International Criminal Court, and the others with him, like Nafi and Ali Usman and so on. So it seems to take a long time. I think one important issue to clarify will be whether or not Bashir will be handed over. But because that will take on not only real but also symbolic character. But there are, I'm sure, people also in support of the revolution who are ambivalent to handing Bashir over to a foreign court, because they think that that is something they should be able to do in Sudan. At the moment, the process is constantly delayed. You know, it's they're working on the coup in 1989 and so on. So it seems to take a long time, but it comes up in all the declarations, as you say. But so far, I think we have to expect that it will take a back seat, I'm afraid. But I hope Mansour has another answer to that. More optimistic answer.
If you have something to add, and I also wanted to ask you, because it doesn't seem like sexual and gender-based violence in the context of transitional justice is specifically mentioned in the Juba peace deal. Do you have any insights as to why?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it was dealt with in you know, in the other sections when it comes to dealing with IDPs and refugees, probably. But this is something that is a grave thing, and it should have been mentioned explicitly in the agreements. I think I see what Gunnar was trying to say with regard to the ICC and Bashir. And yes, Gunnar, you are absolutely right. There is some kind of ambivalence, even among those who are supporting the revolution about handing Bashir. Some people would say that this is something we should do here. And, you know, some even jokingly say that we shouldn't give Bashir the privilege of being taken to the ICC. He has to suffer here in Kober prison instead. Again, you're right in mentioning the complexity of the judicial process. The judicial process is something tedious. It takes a very long time. And we have seen this in the committee that was set to investigate the crash of the city. It's taking forever. And because if you want to build a credible judicial case, you have to take a very long time. You have to talk to a lot of people. You have to gather information. You have to verify. And some people are not patient enough to wait all this long. Bashir and his group that orchestrated the coup in 1989, they're now being tried. But this is going to take a very long time, probably years, you know, to be effective. And again, even the process of handing Bashir to ICC, even if the decision is taken, it's going to take a very long time because there is a very tedious judicial process. The Sudanese law does not allow handing over a citizen to a foreign court, and the law has to be changed to allow this to happen. So it's going to take a very long time. And one more thing that adds to the complexity or to complicate the scene even more the fact that the judiciary in Sudan has a lot of problems and issues. Of course, you all followed that we had a female chief of justice, but people are now quite disappointed about the behavior of this chief of justice. She is not proactive. She is delaying process. She is against some of the things that are supposed to take place. And you know, at the end of the day, we end up having a judiciary system that needs a lot of work to you know, to be done. Even the office of the public prosecutor, you know, he is very energetic man, he is proactive, but it has a lot of challenges and problems. So, you know, and one more thing to add here is that the Constitutional Declaration mentioned clearly that there should be a commission on transitional justice. One of the frustrating things is that as yet, this commission is not established. And we don't understand why such a delay takes place for a commission that as critical as a transitional justice. This gives you a glimpse, you know, or at least some ideas about the challenges that are going to face the, you know, achieving justice or even the transitional justice during the transition. I think we will see a lot of delays, and people will get frustrated about the fact that justice is not being served as quickly as it should. I really don't know how to deal with this, at least from the perspective of the transitional government. But I think one of the very critical steps is first to establish this commission, and then probably things will start moving in a bit of a speedy way.
Well, thank you so much. I actually don't have any more questions, so I would like to open up for the audience to ask them. Are there anyone online also?
If I may.
Yeah, you may.
If I may only add, you know, what kind of factors will affect the revolution more than we've talked about the economy. But I think in broad terms, I think the relationship between what we could call internal spoilers, because they are there. You know, 1989, when the Islamists came to power, they took over all the command positions, also in the Sudanese economy, the banking, the insurance company, everything. Some of these people are still there. There are these almost daily accusations that they are manipulating the currency in their favor, but also to undermine the government. We don't know the strength of these elements in Darfur, in Khartoum, and other places. The relationship between these internal spoilers and external actors will be, I think, very decisive. And with the external actors, I think the neighborhood, mainly South Sudan has not been mentioned, but they are still there. Egypt, particularly, with their security apparatus, but also the Gulf countries. And then a second issue, I think, will be whether or not the one of the de facto leaders of Sudan at the moment, Hemeti, who is the second in command formally, whether he will continue to go with the reformists or whether he would at some point turn, you know, and go with the Islamists of some kind, Islamists of some kind. At the moment, he is still, I think, going with the reformists somehow, but he is in a very powerful position, as in my interpretation, to change the game or to affect this game. But second, finally, I think that, and Mansour has been also persistent in saying the same, that there will be a need all the time for compromise. You know, there are lots of arms in Sudan, also in the peripheries of Sudan. And the civilian government has to work with the military. I don't think there is any alternative than to work somehow with the military. So the question is, how can we, I think in a long process, still keep on the burner, the revolution on the burner, so that Sudan will be moving in the positive direction. Because I don't think that is something that will it will beyond this next year, definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think just to add a little to what Gunnar was saying by way of looking at the challenges and spoilers. One level that should be taken into consideration is this state level, and here I exactly mean the challenges that would face the armed groups themselves. You know, now we look at the armed groups that signed the agreement vis-a-vis the transitional government as such, but they might appear some challenges that face these armed groups when it comes to the local levels, because there are also issues of power sharing and wealth sharing at the local levels, and there might appear some kind of competition even among the within the armed groups themselves. That is one of the things. And the second, at the national level, I think, and I mentioned this earlier on, that the traditional political establishment, at least the political parties, need to somehow leave their comfort zone. You know, this is a different political context, and they have to a little bit move beyond the Khartoum's perspective, the center's perspective, and what's happening actually in Eastern Sudan directly links to what I'm trying to say, that we have to be more, regionally focused to address the challenges that are going to face the transition.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Sarah, and then Amna.
I have 3 questions. The first 2 are for Manzul, and then the third could be answered or ignored. So the first 2 are about the reparations, so-called reparations that the U.S. government is asking for, the 330 million plus. It sounds like there's a kind of internal tension, right? A pragmatic voice that says we should just pay the money because the U.S. is giving us more than this anyway and move on. But then there's also the kind of symbolic gesture that paying this is prompting, right? It's asking the populace to take responsibility for actions of a few individuals from a number of years ago. And I wonder if there's maybe some elaboration that Manzul could provide on that. The second question is about the normalization of relations with Israel. If you could just expand a little bit about what kind of local popular sentiment is on the prospect. Are people for, against, or indifferent on it, especially in light of recent normalization of relations with Israel that have happened in the region? And the third question is kind of an odd one, but whatever happened to George Clooney's satellite that he had over the border between Sudan and South Sudan? Is he still doing like monitoring of activities? And what has happened with the kind of external private pressures on Sudan, such as the state Darfur efforts of Hollywood superstars and other actors like that?
We'll collect some questions and before I give the word back to so Amna and then Louisa.
Okay, yeah, I've got a question. I appreciated all the comments regarding the foreign relations with the Gulf, with the USA, with the role of the EU. I was just wondering, in most of Sudan's neighbors, especially to the south, you see the influence of China. And is that a relevant actor at all? China often seemed to have stability above all as its kind of slogan when operating in Africa. Do anyone in the panel envision a future Chinese role in Sudan?
Yeah, Mansour, you talked about political parties and their need to kind of broaden their perspectives and constituencies maybe, but I was wondering about the armed groups. Are they hinting at any intention of being part of an electoral process and maybe also to transform themselves into political parties or to integrate themselves in already existing parties?
Can I give the word first to Mansour and then Gunnar? And then
Okay, thank you. I think I will. I didn't get the first question by Sarah, but Louisa, this is a very good question. Initially, I was one of the people in the country that thought that once Bashir's regime was gone, the armed groups should put down their arms and they either join existing political parties or form their own parties. Of course, I was quite naive because it took them more than a year to agree on the issues and sign a deal. And they did insist that they should be exempted from Article 20, that bans those who were part of the transition to stand elections, which means that they're intending to be part of the election process. But as yet, it wasn't clear whether they will form their own political parties or whether they join existing political parties. It's really not clear to me. But judging from the previous experience of those who signed agreement with Bashir's regime, there is a likelihood that at least some of these groups would form their own political parties. Let us not forget the fact that I think the SPLM North already is a political party. So they might as well simply try to revitalize that. But others like Minni, like Justice and Equality Movement, I'm not sure. But my thinking is that they will end up creating their own political parties.
Sarah was asking about how do Sudanese feel about this normalizing ties with Israel? What are the sentiments on the ground? And also, if you could say, elaborate a bit more on the discussion between the pragmatic sort of line that you were advocating to just pay the money versus, the symbolic act of paying all of this money for something that very few people was behind many years ago.
Yeah, well, I think the issue of normalization, I think I saw some online questions and polls, which are not, of course, realistic, or we cannot judge on the accuracy of that. But I think generally people would go that let us just go for our own national interest. Supporting the Palestinians doesn't mean that we should get hurt, for decades. So generally, there is a public support for the move towards normalization. Now, the problem is that you have political parties like the Sudanese Communist Party, like the Ba'ath Party, like the Nasserist Party, and I'm actually quite surprised that as yet somebody is telling us that he is a member of the Ba'ath political party, But anyway, these are these political parties are quite small, as a matter of fact, but they are clinging to these ideological positions and blocking the move, saying that the transition government is not mandated to take this step, which is quite strange, because the transition government is mandated to sign a peace agreement, but it is not mandated to do so and so. So you have this sort of thing, but I think my feeling is that this is going to happen. I think normalization is going to take place. That is my reading to the situation. And as Gunnar mentioned earlier, that the US administration seems to be giving Sudan an ultimatum, a deadline. You have to do this. And maybe in the coming few days, we will hear something about that.
Well, you talked about George Clooney. I don't see so much of this happening now in the US. One might expect that there would be pressure on the Congress and activities, related to these reclamations and the money and so on. But I don't see that appearing in the public domain as it used to be. So I don't think they have this kind of activity level. They seem to have given up on South Sudan. It's understandable, I think, in the circumstances, because that is a story in itself. And the same with the role of China. The Chinese are there. There was recently a visit from China, and Hamdok, I think, is going to China soon. But there is also a deal with the Russians, and I've been wondering why this was wise to do exactly at the time when they are dealing now with the Americans on these sensitive issues. But the Russians have sent a naval ship to Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast, which is going to be used as a training ship, and there will be Russians there on board for some time. You know, and the Saudis are always worried about all kinds of activities from the Russians or from Turkey in that area. So I was a bit surprised that this happened exactly at the time when the Americans are putting this pressure on Sudan, because it might be a good thing to balance, but at the moment I don't think the Russians have the kind of money that actually Sudan needs, or the kind of assistance that they actually need. It's quite complicated, and the Chinese seem to be also taking, you know, looking at this at the moment. Probably Sudan has a lot of debt actually to the Chinese. I'm not sure how that works itself out, which at least money that has not been paid back. But at the moment they seem to be waiting to see. Yeah.
Our time is kind of up, but maybe if there's someone who has a last pressing question, we could squeeze it in.
I think the pressure to, if Biden wins the election, I think that particular pressure to normalize relations with Israel may be taken off their shoulders. Because that is clearly this Trump kind of diplomacy is a game of negotiations, and you deal harshly, you know, with those who do not want to do. So exactly that, but the 300 plus US dollars will not be taken off. That will be the same, whether we have a Democrat.
Yeah. Any famous last words, Mansour?
Well, no, I think I don't have anything to add. I am optimist all the time, although I share some of the pessimism that Gunnar, you know, at least as far as the economy is concerned.
Yeah.
That is something we cannot lie about.
Any last few words, Gunnar, before we?
No, I think that there are so many constellations of factors, you know, that will decide or determine this. You have the legacy of the former regime, corruption, inequalities, the fact that the Sudan became very fragmented, became very violent and militarized, you know, all these factors. Then you have all the internal actors, all those actors who want to sit around the table and be part of the decision making. And then thirdly, you know, all the external actors, the important external actors. So this is complicated, but it is, I think, quite impressive that the Sudanese revolution is still there. I think that is quite in itself quite impressive, and that gives hope. And as I said, there is a strong card that they are willing to be killed. There were lots of people, you know. It was a people's revolution, and I think they could do that again. And secondly, you know, the neighborhood, they don't want Bashir and his gang back in power. So they have these cards on the hand,
yeah,
and they will remain for a while. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for your contribution to this very interesting panel, and thank you for coming.